Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. Chapter 5 Wool and Water. She caught the shawl as she spoke and looked about for the owner, and in another moment the White Queen came running wildly through the wood, both her arms stretched out wide as if she were flying, and Alice very civilly went to meet her with the shawl. I'm very glad I happened to be in the way, Alice said as she helped her put on the shawl again. The White Queen only looked at her in a helpless, frightened sort of way and kept repeating something in a whisper to herself. It sounded something like bread and butter, bread and butter, bread and butter. And Alice felt that if there was any conversation at all, she must manage it for herself. And she began rather timidly, Am I addressing the White Queen? Well, yes, if you can call it addressing, the Queen said. It isn't my notion of the thing at all. Alice thought it would never do to have an argument at the beginning of their conversation, so she smiled and said, If your Majesty will only tell me the right way to begin, I'll do it as well as I can. But I don't want it done at all, groaned the poor Queen. I've been addressing myself for the last 2 hours. It would have been all the better, as it seemed to Alice, if she had got someone else to dress her, as she was looking so dreadfully untidy. Every single thing's crooked, Alice thought to herself, and she's all over pins. Maybe I would Maybe I should set this shawl straight for you, she added aloud. I don't know what's the matter with it, said the Queen in a melancholy tone. It's quite out of temper, I think. I've pinned it here and I've pinned it there, but there's no pleasing it. It can't go straight, you know, if you pin it all over on one side, said Alice, and she gently put it right for her. Oh, and dear me, what a state your hair is in. The brush has gotten entangled in it, the Queen said with a sigh, and I lost my comb yesterday. Alice carefully released the brush and did her best to get the hair into some sort of order. Come, you look rather better now, she said after altering most of the pins, but you really should have a lady's maid. I'm sure I'll take you with pleasure, the Queen said. 2 pence a week and jam every other day. Alice couldn't help laughing as she said, I don't want you to hire me, and I don't care for jam. But it's very good jam, said the Queen. Well, I don't want any today at any rate. You couldn't have it if you didn't want it. If you did want it, the rule is jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today. It must come sometimes to jam today, Alice objected. No, it can't. It's jam every other day. Today isn't any other day, you know. I don't understand you, said Alice. It's dreadfully confusing. That's the effect of living backwards, the Queen kindly said. It always makes one a little giddy at first. Living backwards, Alice repeated in great astonishment. I've never heard of any such a thing. But there's one great advantage in it, that one's memory works both ways. I'm sure that mine only works one way, Alice remarked. I can't remember things before they happen. It's a sort of poor memory that only works backwards, the Queen remarked. What sort of things do you remember best? Alice ventured to ask. Oh, things that happened the week after next, the Queen replied in a careless tone. For instance, now, she went on, sticking a larger piece of plaster on her finger as she spoke, there's the King's messenger. He's in prison now, being punished, and the trial doesn't even begin until next Wednesday. And of course, the crime comes last of all. Suppose he never commits the crime, said Alice. That would be all the better, wouldn't it? The Queen said, as she bound the plaster around her finger with a piece of ribbon. Alice felt there was no denying that. Of course, it would be better, all the better, she said. But wouldn't it be better than his being punished? You're wrong there, at any rate, said the Queen. Were you ever punished? Only for fault, said Alice. And were you all the better for it? I know, the Queen said triumphantly. Yes, but I had done things I was punished for, and that makes all the difference. But if you hadn't done them, that would have been better still. Better and better and better. Her voice went higher with each better, till it got quite to a squeak at the last. Alice was just beginning to say, There's a mistake somewhere, when the Queen began screaming so loud that she had to leave the sentence unfinished. Oh, 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 shouted the Queen, shaking her hand as if she wanted to shake it off. My finger's bleeding. Oh, oh, and her screams were so exactly like the whistle of a steam engine that Alice had to hold both her hands over her ears. What is the matter? She said as soon as there was a chance of making herself heard. Have you pricked your finger? Oh, I haven't pricked it yet, the Queen said, but I shall soon. Oh, oh, oh. And when do you expect to do it? Alice asked, feeling very inclined to laugh. When I fasten my shawl again, the poor Queen groaned out. The brooch will come undone directly. Oof. And the words and the brooch flew open, and the queen clutched wildly at it, trying to clasp it again. "Take care!" cried Alice. "You're holding it all crooked." And she caught at the brooch, but it was too late. The pin had slipped, and the queen had pricked her finger. "That accounts for all the bleeding, you see," said Alice with a smile, now understanding the way that things happen here. "But why don't you scream now?" Alice asked, holding her hands ready to put it over her ears again. "Why, I've already done all the screaming already," said the queen. "What good would it be to having to do it all over again?" By this time it was getting light, and the crow must have flown away, I think, said Alice. "I'm glad it's gone. I thought it was the night coming on." "I wish I could manage to be glad," said the queen. "Only I never can remember the rule. You must be very happy living in this wood and being glad whenever you like." "Only it is so very lonely here," Alice said in a melancholy voice, and at the thought of her loneliness 2 large tears came rolling down her cheeks. "Oh, don't go on like that," cried the poor queen, wringing her hands in despair. "Consider what a great girl you are. Consider what a long way you've come today. Consider what o'clock it is. Consider anything, only don't cry." Alice could not help laughing at this, even in the midst of her tears. "Can you keep from crying by considering things?" she asked. "That's the way it's done," said the queen, with great decision. "Nobody can do 2 things at once, you know. Let's consider your age, and begin with, how old are you exactly?" "I'm 7 and a half exactly." "Well, you needn't say exactly," the queen remarked. "I can believe it without that. Now, I'll give you something to believe. I'm just 101 and 5 months and a day." "I can't believe that," said Alice. "Can't you?" said the queen with a pitying tone. "Try again and draw a long breath and shut your eyes." Alice laughed. "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the queen. "When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Oh, there goes my shawl again." And the brooch had come undone as she had spoke, and a sudden gust of wind had blew the queen's shawl across the little brook, and the queen spread out her arms again and went flying after it, and this time she succeeded in catching it for herself. "I've got it!" she cried in a triumphant tone. "Now you shall see me pin it on again, all by myself." "Then I hope your finger is better now," Alice said very politely as she crossed the little brook after the queen. "Oh, much better," cried the queen, her voice rising to a squeak as she went on. "Much better, 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 bet." And the last word was more than a long bleat, so like a sheep that Alice was quite startled. So she looked down at the queen, who seemed to have suddenly wrapped herself up in wool. Alice rubbed her eyes and looked at it again. She couldn't make out what had happened at all. Was she in a shop? And was it really a sheep sitting on the other side of the counter? Rub as she would, she could not make anything more of it, and she was soon in a dark little shop, leaning with her elbows on the counter, and opposite her was an old sheep sitting in an armchair knitting, and every now and then leaving off to look at her through a great pair of spectacles. "What is it you want to buy?" the sheep said at last, looking up for a moment from her knitting. "I don't quite know yet," Alice said very gently. "I should like to look around for a while first, if I might." "You may look in front of you and on both sides if you like, but you can't look all around you unless you've got eyes in the back of your head." But these, as it happened, Alice had not got. So she contented herself with looking around and looking at the shelves as they as she came to them. The shop seemed to be full of all manner of curious things, but the oddest part of all was whenever she looked hard at any one shelf to make out exactly what it had on it. That particular shelf always was quite empty, though the others around it seemed crowded and as full as they could hold. "Things flow about so here," she said at last in a plaintive tone, as she spent a minute or so vainly pursuing a large, bright thing that sometimes looked like a doll and sometimes looked like a workbook, and always in the next shelf above it was the one that she was looking at. "And this is one of the most provoking things of all. But I'll tell you what," she added, as sudden thought struck her. "I'll follow it up to the very top shelf of all, and it'll puzzle to go through how the ceiling, I expect." But even this plan failed. The thing went right through the ceiling as quietly as possible, as if it were quite used to it. "Are you a child or a teetotum?" the sheep asked as she looked. up through another pair of needles. You'll make me giddy soon. And if you go on turning round like that. She was now working out with 14 pairs at once, and Alice couldn't help but look at her in great astonishment. How can you knit with so many? Asked the puzzled child, thought to herself. She gets more and more like a porcupine every minute. Can you row? The sheep asked, handing her a pair of knitting needles as she spoke. Yes, a little, but not on land, and not with needles. Alice was beginning to say, and suddenly the needles turned into oars in her hands, and she was in a little boat gliding between the banks. So there was nothing for it but to do her best. Feather, cried the sheep, as she took up a pair of needles. This didn't sound like a remark that needed any answer to, so Alice said nothing, but pulled away. There was something very queer about the water, she thought, and every now and then the oars got fast in it and would hardly come out again. Feather, feather, the sheep cried again, taking more needles. You'll be catching a crab directly. A dear little crab, thought Alice. I should like that. Didn't you hear me say feather? And the sheep cried angrily, taking up quite a bunch of needles. Indeed, I did, said Alice. You've said it very often and very loud. Please, where are the crabs? In the water, of course, said the sheep, sticking some of the needles into her hair as her hands were full. Feather, I say. Why do you say feather so often? Alice asked at last, rather vexed. I'm not a bird. You are, said the sheep. You are a little goose. This offended Alice a little, so there was no more conversation for a minute or two, while the boat glided gently on, sometimes among beds of weeds which made the oars stick fast in the water worse than ever, and sometimes under trees, but always the same tall river banks frowning down over their heads. Oh, please, there are some scented rushes, Alice cried in sudden transport of delight. They really are. Oh, such beauties. You didn't say please to me about 'em, said the sheep without looking up from her knitting. I didn't put 'em there, and I'm not going to take them away. No, but I meant, please, may we pick, please wait and pick some, Alice pleaded, if you don't mind stopping the boat for a minute. How am I to stop it? Said the sheep. If you leave off rowing, it'll stop by itself. So the boat was left adrift down the stream as it would until it glided gently among the waving rushes. And then the little sleeves were carefully rolled up, and the little arms were plunged in elbow deep to get a hold of the rushes and a good long way down before breaking them off. And for a while Alice forgot all about the sheep and the knitting, and she bent over the side of the boat with just the ends of her tangled hair dripping into the water, while with bright eager eyes she caught up at one bunch and after another the darling scented rushes. I only hope the boat won't tipple over, she said to herself. Oh, what a lovely one! Only I couldn't quite reach it, and it certainly did seem a little provoking, almost as if it happened on purpose, she thought. But though she managed to pick plenty of beautiful rushes as the boat glided by, there were always more lovely ones that she just couldn't reach. The prettiest is always further, she said at last, with a sigh of obstinacy of the rushes growing so far off as if it flushed her cheeks and dripping hair and hands. She scrambled back to her place and began to arrange the new-found treasures. What mattered it to her just then was that the rushes had beginning to fade and lose all their scent and beauty from the very moment that she picked them. Even very real, even real scented flushes, last only a little while, and these being dream rushes meant they melted away like snow as they lay in heaps at her feet. And while Alice hardly noticed this, there were so many other curious things about. They hadn't gone much farther before a blade of one of the oars got fast in the water and wouldn't come out again, so explained Alice afterwards. And the consequence of that was the handle of it got caught under her chin, and in spite of series of little shrieks of "oh, oh, oh" from poor Alice, it swept her straight off her seat and down among a heap of rushes. However, she wasn't hurt a bit, and was soon up again. The sheep went on with her knitting all the while, just as if nothing had happened. That was a nice little crab you caught, she remarked as Alice got back into place, very much relieved to find herself still sitting in the boat. Was it? I didn't see it, Alice said, peeping cautiously over the side of the boat and into the dark water. I wish it hadn't let go. I should like to see a little crab take home with me. But the sheep only laughed scornfully and went on her knitting. And are those many crabs here? Said Alice. Crabs and all sorts of things, said the sheep. Plenty of choice. Only make up your mind. What do you want to buy? To buy? Echoed Alice, and tone was half astonished, half frightened, for the oars, the boat, and the river had vanished all in a moment, and she was back again in the dark little shop. I could see I'd like to buy an egg, please, she said rather timidly. How do you sell them? 5 pence farthing for one, 2 pence for two, the sheep replied. Then two are cheaper than one? Alice said in a surprised tone, taking out her purse. Only you must eat them both if you buy two, said the sheep. Then I'll have one, please, as Alice said as she put the money down on the counter, for she thought to herself, they might not be all that nice, you know. The sheep took the money and put it away in a box. And then she said, I never put things into people's hands. That wouldn't never do. You must get it for yourself. And so saying, she went off to the other end of the shop and set the egg upright on a shelf. I wonder why it wouldn't do, thought Alice, as she groped her way among the tables and chairs for the shop, as it was very dark toward the end. The egg seems to get further away the more I walk towards it. Let me see. Is this a chair? Why, it's got branches. I declare, how very odd to find trees growing here. It's actually here's a little brook, and well, this very queerest shop I ever saw. And so she went on, wondering more and more at every step, as everything turned into a tree the moment she came up to it, and she was quite expected the egg to do the same.